On today's show, the Caps didn't spend this offseason just to get back into the playoffs. They spent it because they believe they can make a real run, and now they have to prove it.
Hey, this is Ryan Leonard from the Washington Capitals. Tune in to my favorite podcast, Lock On Capitals.
Your Locked On Capitals, your daily podcast on the Washington Capitals.
Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Well, hello, and welcome into this edition of Locked On Capitals, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Dan Holmi, and today's episode is brought to you by our friends at FanDuel. Join all the action at FanDuel.com to play Daily Dingers and make your free pick on who's hitting a homer this MLB season. So in this edition of Locked On Capitals, we talk about expectations for the 26-27 season, what failure looks like, but where we will start is what success looks like. And that's the big thing to quantify here, because I'm going to put this target right on the board right now. The Eastern Conference Final is what a successful season looks like to me for the Caps. And I get it. I know it's a bit aggressive, and I'm okay with that. Because I don't think you can look at what happened this last season and look at what Chris Patrick did this summer and then pretend the goal is simply getting into the playoffs. That was the goal last year. And to be honest, if Chris Patrick didn't make any big moves this past summer here or this summer, that would have kind of been my goal for them this coming season. But that's not true. That he came out swinging that, just saying that the Capitals made it to the playoffs, victory, I don't think that is the case. Like I said, that was the goal for last year's team, and they missed. And the response wasn't to stay patient and hope that this same group of players suddenly figured everything out. That the Caps went after their biggest problem, scoring. That they finished with 261 goals. That is 15th in the NHL, and the power play was nowhere good enough. And we'll talk about that a bit later. Those are the things that caused the Capitals to struggle last season. So you take a look at it, the front office went out and they changed the equation. And that's what I'm interested in. Not simply whether they can score more goals. I want to know whether they become a fundamentally harder team to defend. And if they are going to be a better team, the offense has got to change. Because think about how the Caps or how the teams defended the Caps last season, right? There were too many nights when the game plan was pretty obvious, right? Take away Ovechkin, crowd the middle, make the Caps work along the boards and force them to play to the outside. And if the other teams were able to stop the Capitals from getting to the middle of the ice, a lot of that offensive pressure dissipated. And that is the part I think that really has to change. And this is where Kyrou becomes so important. That this was a move that was made even before free agency, right? That was a sign to me that the Capitals were going to be very aggressive this summer. Talking about Kyrou, if he can get the puck moving north before the defense is completely set, I think that suddenly the Caps aren't spending every possession trying to break down five guys standing in front of them. And that changes the way everybody else gets defended. And Tuch, right? Tuch can attack with more room. Ovechkin doesn't have to be the answer every time they need a goal. And I think that was the case last season, as evident by the fact that he led the team in goals. And also Wilson. Let's not forget Wilson and what kind of goals he can put up. He's not just the tough guy. So Wilson can get involved around the crease without the entire defense knowing exactly where the puck is going. And then you take a look up the middle. Suddenly Dubois, right, has more room to attack through the middle. That is the whole idea. The Caps don't need every player to put up a career number again, like they did a couple seasons ago. That was nice, but ultimately, did it get him a cup? No. But I think it is the sum total of this group of players playing well. They need opponents to have a much harder time figuring out where the danger is coming from, because last season, you could take away too much of this offense by taking away one particular thing. That it was said, around NHL circles that the Capitals were too predictable. That cannot happen anymore, nor should it. If this offseason worked like the way I think it is going to, the cap should be able to hurt you even when you take away the first option. That, to me, is what success looks like. But Kyrou, right, he is the swing piece here. That the Capitals gave up a lot to get Kyrou. How much does he factor into everything? And for me, I think that Jordan Kyrou is probably the biggest swing piece on the entire roster, because we know what he can be, right? This isn't the player the Caps acquired because they think maybe he could someday become a 30-goal scorer. He's already done that. That we're not speculating, right? We're not spitballing, that if you take a look at the back of his hockey card, he has done it. He's already been a 70-point player. The problem is that last season he dropped to 18 goals and 46 points. Now, there's reasons for that, of course, it was not St. Louis's finest hour, that their team struggled, that their coach put him in the doghouse for a while, that he faced injury. So you got to kind of look at it from a wide-angle lens. You can't just look exclusively at the back of his hockey card. I am willing to dismiss the 18 goals and 46 points based on big picture. But it is a significant fall from before. And that's why this trade to me was so interesting, because if the Caps get last year's Kyrou, I think that they paid a lot for a player who didn't give them the thing that they were looking for, right? For speed and scoring. But if they get the player they believe is still there, then I think the Capitals have really got something there. That I think the speed is still there. The puck skills are still there, and that's what makes him such an important fit. The Caps needed someone who could create offense before the opposing defense had time to get comfortable. Kyrou can do that. And what does he do? He can carry the puck through the neutral zone and force defenders to back up with his speed. That the Capitals have some quick players even before the moves that were made this summer, but they are much quicker now. That Kyrou is a guy that can turn a possession that looks completely, what I'm going to say, harmless into a scoring opportunity. And when you have somebody doing that, it opens space for everybody else out on the ice. So yeah, I'm expecting around 30 goals and at least 65 points. Not because there's some important magic associated to him. That is just kind of my goal for him, just based on his history. Because I think that if Kyrou gets there, it tells me the Capitals got the player that they were trading for, right? That they gave up Connor McMichael, Milton Gastreen, and a first-round pick. That it is proof positive. That if Kyrou rebound, shall we say, that is a huge change for this team. Of course, the other big move that, oh my God, Chris Patrick is for real, that Alex Tuch changes the identity. Because when we get into Tuch, and I think this is where the identity of the offense really starts to feel different. The 33 goals and 66 points from last season are obviously eye-popping, impressive, right? But that's not even, to me, what catches my attention. It's how he got those points. He's a big winger who can move. He can attack off the rush, can drive the net, right? Can create something without waiting for the perfect play to develop. And I think that is exceedingly important because the Caps spent too much of last season waiting for the perfect play. How many times did you hear Joby and Locker or John Walton? They made too many passes, or Alan May on the post game. He always does a good post-mortem on the game, if you will. That, there was the play, and you tried to get too fancy with it, and you blew a scoring opportunity. So those are the things that I think need to get cleaned up, and I think that they have more finishers now than they had before. There were possessions where last season everybody seemed to be looking for one more pass, one more setup, just another opportunity. And by the time they were ready to attack, well, the defense was already comfortable. Tuch changes things. He doesn't need everything to be comfortable. Just set that guy free and he can go. And that is, I think, extremely valuable to the Capitals. Now, when you take a look at Kyrou and Tuch, imagine what that does for the rest of the lineup. If a defense is worried about Kyrou coming through the neutral zone, now they have to respect that speed. If they're worried about Tuch coming downhill, right, they have to respect the physical part of his game as well. They're also trying to deal with both of those problems and make life easier for Ovechkin, right? That is ultimately, Kyrou and Tuch, that it is not the focal point that the puck is always coming from Ovechkin. I mean, to be clear here, Ovechkin's going to get his fair share of goals as well, but you don't necessarily know it's coming from Ovi every single time because Kyrou and Tuch are lethal goal scorers in and of themselves. And that is ultimately the kind of chain reaction that I want to see here. For Tuch, I'm looking for around 30 goals and 65 points. Again, these aren't magical numbers here, but that would be nice. And it should be attainable considering what he put up last year. Because I don't think, when we talk about Kyrou and Tuch, I don't think the numbers tell the entire story. I want to watch him in November and think to myself, yeah, this guy changes the way teams have to play the Caps. That is ultimately what they're getting paid for at the end of the day, right? But the elephant in the room as well is the power play has got to work. Now, this is where I'm going to raise the bar in a big way. I don't want to hear that the power play is better than last year. Good. If it wasn't, I'd be concerned. I don't want to hear that it went from terrible to mediocre. I want top 10, period. And I understand that is a lofty goal, but the Caps made changes this summer. They acknowledged that who was running the power play and how the power play was being used was not good. That's why they brought in Ray Bennett. Now, Ray Bennett, a bit of a polarizing guy as well. Ray Bennett replaces Kirk Muller as on head coach Spencer Carberry's staff. He's the guy that's going to be pushing the buttons on the power play. Of course, Bennett previously won a Stanley Cup with the Avalanche in 2022 and has managed power play units for LA, St. Louis, Colorado, and the Islanders. There is quite a bit of skepticism, I'm going to say, out there, just doing my research, sticking my finger to the wind and hearing what the fans are saying. Our opinions are mixed, where some fans worry about past power play struggles with the Islanders, while others praise his long track record of top 10 man advantage units in Colorado. So, he can do what he can do. He can scheme things up a little bit, but the players have got to execute. And I think that bringing in Ray Bennett, I think that, different looks, different angles, that could be different. But eventually you have to stop blaming the personnel. The Caps have plenty of talent right now. And that biggest talent on the PP is Jacob Chychrun. Right? He scored 26 goals and 60 points last season, and he led the Caps in power play goals. That's on Unit 1. Oh, but there's more. What's behind door number 2? Cole Hudson running the second power play unit, right? At least on paper, that's the way I'm looking at it. That when you take a look at Chychrun, he's being asked to quarterback that unit. Good. That's right. Continue to give Chychrun responsibility. Let him run it. And let's see what happens when Kyrou can give them another way to enter the zone. When Tuch can make himself a problem around the crease, and when Ovechkin is still waiting for that lethal one-timer from his office. That, on paper, should be dangerous. It does not need to be perfection. It just needs to make opposing teams nervous about taking penalties, right? And that's a good thing, because that's what a good power play does. It changes the way the other teams play against them. And if we're sitting here in March and the Caps are still near bottom of the league, then I am going to have some serious questions. Was Ray Bennett the guy? Was the construction of the power play good? The guys that we have quarterbacking PP1 and PP2, are they the right guys, right? Because you can't keep telling me season after season the personnel isn't good enough when you've spent an offseason improving that personnel. And at some point, that is a systems problem. Another player, like I talked about, being the QB of PP2 is Hudson. And this is where I want to be careful. I'm not expecting him to be, suddenly be a 60-point defenseman. I don't even think he needs to carry the blue line. I want him to become someone Spencer Carberry trusts. Right? That is the next step. The offensive ability, I think, is obvious. We saw it in his brief stint in the NHL last season, not to mention at BU. But playing 14 games and playing meaningful minutes over an entire season are two very different things, right? That, we got caught up. I got caught up in the hype. What does he look like over a complete season? How does a smaller framed defender fare over a complete 84 game season? How does he fare when teams can prepare for what he does? That some of it was the newness, the novelty of Cole Hudson, that you didn't know exactly what he was going to do. Now teams know what they're getting. They're going to pressure him. They're going to test him physically. They're going to make him defend. The thing that I'm optimistic about Hudson here is that his hockey IQ is off the chains here, right? I think that he sees plays coming. It's not like he's some, non-intelligent player out there that doesn't know how to play. Eventually there's going to be games where he makes mistakes, and that's okay. We were hard on John Carlson. John Carlson, number 74, just this huge defender, stud on the blue line, and if he made a mistake, that's why that guy's got to go. We need to be easy on these guys, especially on a guy like Cole Hudson that's still young. No, what I need to see is how he responds to that physicality, that adversity. Can he continue to make that next play? Can he play under pressure? Can he defend well enough that Carberry doesn't start looking down the bench when the game gets tough, shall we say? Because I think if Cole gets to that point, suddenly the Caps have another way to attack. Instead of recovering the puck and immediately throwing it out, they can turn defense into transition, right? They can get it moving. They can attack before the other team gets set. That matters, especially in the playoffs. Another player that we're going to need to see more of this season, I think, is Thompson. I actually think the offensive improvements could make his job easier. He doesn't need to be the guy that has to stand on his head every night because they aren't producing offense or the defenders aren't standing up. But he needs to give the Caps a chance. And every once in a while, yes, he has got to steal one because that's why he's the number one. That's why he's making a boatload of money. But now with the offensive weapons, the Caps don't need to win 2-1 every night because they have legitimate offensive weapons. If the offense does what I think it can do, Thompson can give up 3 and still win a game. Not all the time, but I think it's not insurmountable, shall we say. And if he's playing well like he did last year, Vezina quality, now we've got something. That is the balancing act. We're going to need to see more from Chucky as well. I'm going to need to knock that rust off. Hope that it's Chucky from a couple seasons ago. They need to manage that position. That I liked how they leaned into Logan Thompson last year, but we also want to give Chucky his reps. And if Chucky isn't it, there's a guy in Clay Stevenson that I've talked about that is looking for an opportunity. Because this isn't the point to win every game in October. The point is to have the best version of this team available when the playoffs begin. So to wrap up segment 1 here, that is the success for me. For me, it's not 95 points. It's not eking into the playoffs. It's not winning one round and calling the season a success. I want to see the Caps win 2 playoff rounds. I want to see what Kyrou looks like with a Capitals jersey on. Were they the player that they were hoping for when they acquired him? I want Tuch to change the way teams defend. I want the power play to finally become something that the opponent has got to respect. They didn't respect it last year. I want to see what steps Hudson and Leonard take forward. I want to see how good Logan Thompson and Charlie Lindgren can be between the pipes, and that will be markers for success. Because once you make the Eastern Conference Final, the expectation failure gets a whole lot more uncomfortable. That's where we're headed, straight ahead. Keep it right here. Baseball fans, if you think you know who's hitting a homer today, FanDuel is giving you a free chance to call your shot with Daily Dingers. It's easy to play. Just make a free pick for who you think is hitting a homer in their game. If you're right, you'll receive a profit boost to use on your next chance at extra winnings. Best of all, you can make a free pick every day throughout the MLB season. Daily Dingers is another fun way to stay engaged with everyday's games, whether you're following your favorite team or keeping an eye on matchups across the league. Every game has someone capable of going deep. Now you get the chance to make your prediction before first pitch. We take a look at the Nats today. Not playing so well as of late, but maybe they can make it right against the Colorado Rockies. And if I'm looking for my favorite for a daily dinger, I don't think we need to look much further than Andreas Chaparro. So, are you ready to play your game? Join all the action at FanDuel.com. That's FanDuel.com to play daily dingers and make your free pick on who's hitting a homer. Play ball and swing for the fences on FanDuel, an official partner of Major League Baseball. All right, welcome back into this edition of Locked On Capitals, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I want to thank you for making this your first listen of the day and for making Locked On the #1 sports podcast network. So in your Monday edition of Locked On Capitals, we're talking about expectations for the 26-27 season, what failure and success looks like. In segment 2, we're talking about what failure looks like, and cover your ears. I don't even really want to talk about it, but the big takeaway is this: failure isn't losing. Failure is wasting the opportunity this offseason created. And that is the difference. That if the Caps get to the Eastern Conference Final and lose a 7-game series to a better team, I'm not calling that a failure. To me, that is successful. Of course, I would love for them to win a Stanley Cup, but if they can make it that far, I think that is a very big step forward. But again, if they miss the playoffs, again, after everything that was done, that is failure. Full stop. Make no mistake. If they get into the playoffs and look exactly like last year's team, right, that's not good, because this wasn't a cheap offseason for Chris Patrick and the Capitals. The Capitals traded McMichael, Gastrine, and the 16th overall pick to St. Louis. Right? And they made an enormous financial commitment to Tuch. So you move mountains to bring in Kyrou and Tuch. They added veteran pieces like Boone Jenner, Vincent Desharnais, Ovi's coming back. The whole band and then some is back together again. The message was pretty obvious to me. They want to win now. So now the team has to look like it. They got Spencer Carberry pushing the buttons behind the bench. I think that at least on paper they look good. But what happens if it's another playoff miss? If the Capitals miss the playoffs, it is a failure. Don't sweep it under the rug. An absolute failure. And I don't think there should be much debate there. They had 95 points last season and watched the playoffs from home. Again, 95 points out west, you were playing in the Stanley Cup, right? To see the Vegas Golden Knights, for example. You can't make this many changes and then end up back in the same place, especially not if the reasons are the same. If we're sitting here in April talking about the offense disappearing again and the power play coming up short, the Caps not being able to score when they need to, that is an absolute failure. Then what exactly did this offseason fix? Those are the uncomfortable questions. The first round matters, though. Now, I'm not going to say every first-round loss is automatically a failure. I think that would be much too simplistic of a way to look at it, that hockey really doesn't work that way. You can play a really good team, go 7 games, and lose. That's just the nature of sports. But, you know, if this team gets into the playoffs and gets pushed out because the offense disappears, right? If they spend 4 games struggling to generate chances and the same problems that existed last year are still there, then I'm going to be disappointed and call it a failure. Because the whole reason for this offseason was to make the Capitals more dangerous, right? If they get to April and the teams are still defending them the same way, then something went wrong. The biggest failure for me is if the power play fails again. And this, to me, is probably the clearest example. That I don't want to be sitting here in March having this same conversation we've been having for years now. Well, maybe the power play will turn around, especially in the fall. You're like, well, they'll figure it out sooner or later. Enough here. The personnel is here. The coaching is here. The talent is here. The shooters, the playmakers, right? They did it all. The Caps don't need to have the best power play in hockey. They need to have the one that punishes teams for taking penalties. That's it, because when you get into the playoffs, those opportunities become incredibly valuable, right? You saw the Capitals not make good on power play opportunities. You saw them miss in the shootout, right? But when you talk about the playoffs, 5-on-5 hockey gets tougher. That same space during the regular season disappears. You get fewer clear chances. And one power play can completely change a series. I think it's safe to say that if the Capitals made good on more of their power play opportunities this past season, they would have been in the playoffs. So if this group is still near the bottom of the league, that's not something I'm going to shrug off, nor should you. A major problem. Another thing, Kyrou has got to rebound. This is another one. If he scores 18 again, I'm going to have a hard time calling the trade that we saw successful. Not because 18 goals makes him a bad player. I don't think that's the case. It's because of what the Capitals gave up to get him. They didn't make the trade because they wanted a 50-point winger. They made it because they believed there was another level there, right? They believed he could get back to being a major offensive weapon. And they need that player, right? They need his speed, his ability to create. They need him to make things happen when the offense or the defense is set. If he doesn't do that, then we're going to have a very uncomfortable conversation about the price of that trade. Tuch, my man, has got to justify the boatload of money in term he got for that contract. And Tuch is a little different because of the contract. He is making $10.5 million per year. That is star money. So I'm not going to sit here and say he's a failure if he doesn't score 40 goals. I think that's ridiculous. It would be nice. But I think he has got to be more than just a good player. If he gives you 25 goals and 55 points, that's a useful player. But that's not really what you're paying for, right? They gave up a lot as far as money in term. You're paying for somebody who can change games, somebody who can take over a shift, somebody who becomes even more valuable when the ice gets smaller in the playoffs. That is what I want to see from him. And talking about Hudson, we talked about success. Let's talk about failure. What happens when his first full season in the NHL? If he disappears, that can happen. If Carberry doesn't trust him, his minutes are going to disappear. And if minutes disappear, you lose some of the puck movement and transition that could make the defense more dangerous. That's why his development is so important. I don't think that he is being asked to save the Caps. He's asked to become part of the solution. And that is a big, big difference. Goaltending, Logan Thompson, right? I'm high on him, but we have seen moments where he gets rattled and he's not his best self. We saw some injuries in seasons before, but the goaltending cannot regress. That Logan Thompson is for sure the number one, make no mistake about it, but what if injury happens? What if he does take a step back for whatever reason? And Charlie Lindgren is the Charlie Lindgren from last season. Well, that can change a lot of things, right? That you got Tuch, Kyrou, Boone Jenner, Desharnais, Ovi's back, but we found a bunch of holes in the boat called goaltending. So Thompson, we need to see dialed in, because if he takes a significant step back, that is a huge problem. Because this team doesn't have the luxury of being average. They need the offense to become a strength. They need the power play to be stellar. They need the goaltending that we believe it is to be what it was last year and better. We need to see more from Chucky when he gets his starts. If everything is just okay, you're right in the middle of the conference. And we've already seen what that gets you, 95 points. And I would say even below, right? Below okay. I'm going to say below average a little bit. 95 points, no playoffs, that's not good enough, especially when you got teams like Carolina that aren't going to make it easy for you. And if you're an everydayer of the show, don't waste my time. That Alex Ovechkin, the Capitals signed him to a 1-year extension. He didn't come back to, make it to the first round. Make no mistake about it. I think Ovechkin's goal as well is the Stanley Cup or the Eastern Conference Final. I don't think Ovi is going to be happy to say we made it to the first or second round. And this is where it gets a little bit bigger than hockey decisions. He is back for season 22, 929 goals. He wanted to know if the Caps were serious about improving before he came back. I think it's message sent, message received. The Capitals were serious. They showed him that they're serious. Now the team needs to deliver, because we don't know how many years we're going to get with Ovi. This could be his final season. And I don't want to say it's Stanley Cup or bust. I don't think that is fair for this team. Kind of feels that way. I know that Strome kind of mentioned that. But if you make these moves, right, you spend this money, trade the assets, and still can give Ovechkin a meaningful playoff run, I think that is a massive missed opportunity. You're not getting that chapter back. So we need to screw things down that are loose. We need to batten the hatches, the power play, the shootout, the overtime. We cannot sweep that under the rug and be surprised if this team isn't playing meaningful hockey in the spring. We've got to come out swinging. Are there going to be ups and downs? For sure. It's best to stay on top of these before they become a real problem. So to wrap up segment 2, failure isn't simply losing. It's failing to become the offseason, it's failing to become the team the offseason promised us. It's missing the playoffs again, having the same broken power play, getting to April and realizing Kyrou never found his game, watching Tuch become, a good player instead of a difference maker. It's having Tuch buried because the coaching staff doesn't trust him. It's getting bad goaltending because, the LT got injured or underperformed or Chucky wasn't good enough. And I think most importantly, it's reaching another April without giving Ovi a meaningful playoff run. That's the failure I'm talking about. Now let's get to what I actually expect. Now what I hope happens, not what I hope happens, what I think happens. And that's where we're headed, straight ahead. Keep it right here. All right, welcome back into this edition of Locked On Capitals, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Talking about Capitals outlook in 26-27 on the Monday edition of Locked On Capitals. So the expectation that I have for 26-27, here's where I land. I expect the Caps to make the Eastern Conference Final. I know I was a little bit, different comments on Locked On NHL, but, I've had time to think about it. I expect the Caps to make the Eastern Conference Final. Not a guarantee, right? I'm not sitting here in August, darn near September, saying they're automatically one of the best teams, 4 teams in the NHL. I'm saying that after this offseason, I expect them to be good enough to win 2 playoff rounds. And I think it's reasonable, right? The organization did their part. They didn't sit, on their hands, shall we say. They went after Kyrou because they needed another player who's quick and can create offense. They brought in Tuch because of the multiple 30-goal seasons, and they needed a different kind of threat. And they added Jenner for his leadership and more depth down the middle and just that Swiss Army knife that has seen almost everything. And they brought Ovechkin back because they believe this team can give him another legit opportunity. That's why I'm setting the bar where I am. I expect a top 5 East. I don't need the Caps to win the Metro. I don't need them to finish first in the conference, but I expect them to be comfortably in the playoff picture. I'd put my expectation around the top 5 in the East, and once the playoffs start, I expect them to win the first series. And then I go a step further. I expect them to win the second. And that is where the Eastern Conference Final comes in. And if they get there, I think the season is a success. That is kind of like the floor. The ceiling for me is the Stanley Cup Final. The season is a success if they make it to the Eastern Conference Final, if you ask me. Like I said, winning the Stanley Cup or making it to the Stanley Cup would be nice. I'm trying to be realistic. This is actually Dan taking it down a notch, if you can believe it, even if they lose in the Eastern Conference Final. Because then we've got evidence to me that the plan worked. The roster got better. The offense was harder to defend. The additions mattered, that you didn't squander McMichael Gastreen in the 16th overall for nothing. And the Caps proved they could actually compete with the best teams in the conference during the final chapter of the Ovi era. That is success. And the offense is why. Everything comes back to the offense for me. Because that was the biggest change that happened. Last year, there were too many nights throughout the season the Caps needed Ovi to be the answer. And that is not tenable. That is not sustainable. This year, the hope is Kyrou can create something before the defense gets too comfortable, shall we say, while Tuch gives them a completely different problem to deal with once they get into the offensive zone. That should create room for everybody else. Ovechkin better opportunities, Wilson, more to be able to move around the net. It should allow Dubois to attack the middle instead of constantly fighting through traffic. And bigger picture here, if Protas and Leonard can continue to keep developing, right? We're talking Ilya, we're talking Ryan Leonard. Now the depth becomes a real advantage. That is what I want to see. I want to see, a team, where shutting down Ovechkin doesn't shut down the entire team, right? If the Caps take away one threat and still have to worry about what comes next, that's when you got an offense capable of winning playoff games, right? The power play will tell us a whole lot. And that is why I think the power play is a measuring stick. Because if the Capitals finish in the top 10, I'm going to feel pretty good about where this team is at. Because you've taken what should have been a deeper 5-on-5 offense and added a power play that can punish teams. But I'm here to tell you, if they're 20th again, I'm not going to be, I don't know what else to say. What didn't work? Because you can't waste that kind of talent. You can't waste what Chris Patrick has assembled and go, it's marginally better than it was last year. You just can't. The Caps have spent too long waiting for the power play to become a consistent weapon. This is the year that we need to see it. Ovechkin, right, should be fresh. And there's another part to this I really like. Ovechkin doesn't have to carry all of the offense on his back. I'm not trying to say that, Wilson and Leonard and everyone else last year didn't do their part, but it still felt, as evidenced by the season end in goals, that Ovechkin had to carry the bulk of the mail. That's actually one of the best things this offseason could give, is that Ovechkin doesn't need to do that. He doesn't have to play huge minutes every night in November. He doesn't have to be the guy everybody looks to every time they need a goal, right? Let the other players carry more of the burden. Let Ovechkin pick his spots. Keep him healthy and fresh. That's what I'm saying, because when the playoffs arrive, that's when I want the best version of Ovi, right? Imagine getting into the second round with Ovechkin having been managed properly all season, healthy, fresh, just lethal in his elder age, I guess you could say. And now we're asking him to play meaningful minutes in a playoff series instead of asking him to carry the team through an 84-game season. That is the version I want to see. But my line in the sand, there is one right down the middle. I expect the Caps to make the playoffs. I expect them to be one of the better teams in the East, the power play to become a legitimate strength, Kyrou to rebound, Tuch to look like the star-level player that they paid for, and Hudson to become somebody Carberry trusts. And above all, I expect the Caps to win 2 playoff rounds. That is the standard, the Eastern Conference Final. And if they don't get there, then we're going to have a very honest conversation about whether this roster and everything that Chris Patrick has done actually worked. So to wrap up today's show, this is the difference between last season and this season. Last year, the Caps were trying to prove they could still compete. This year, they've told us they want to contend. That is a completely different standard. And honestly, I give this team, I give Chris Patrick, the Capitals' big picture, credit for making that decision. They could have stayed conservative. They did not. They took some big swings. They didn't deplete the cupboard. We still have Leonard. We still have Hudson. We still have Crystal, right? We still have the big pieces. We didn't need to sell the farm to get the players that we got. Now I want to see if those swings pay off. All right, once again, I want to thank you for joining me on this edition of Locked On Capitals, your only daily year-round podcast covering the Capitals. And I want to thank all of you that listen on the audio side and watch this on YouTube. You, my friends, are what makes this show successful all summer long. I'm so excited for the start of the hockey season, and I imagine that you guys are as well. For your second listen of the day, check out Locked On NHL, where there is no offseason. Check out Locked On NHL on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts, and also check out the video that you go to directly after this show, Locked On Sports Today, 24/7, where you can get caught up on all of the major sports. All right, once again, I want to thank you for joining me on this edition of Locked On Capitals, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where it is your team every day. My name is Dan Holmi, and I'll talk to you again next time.